My wife came back from that wellness retreat, walking 3 inches taller than when she left. That's the image I keep coming back to. Linette, stepping through the front door on a Sunday evening with this glow about her, like she'd swallowed something warm. New linen pants I'd never seen, hair blown out, a smile that sat differently on her face than the one I was used to. I thought she looked beautiful. I told her so. She kissed me on the cheek and floated upstairs to unpack. I should have been relieved. Instead, something cold moved through me that I couldn't name. 3 weeks later, when the ancestry DNA results came back, the kit she'd ordered for both of us as a fun family history project, her glow vanished the instant I laid the printout on the kitchen table, replaced by something I'd never seen on her face before: raw, cornered panic. That was the beginning of the end, of everything I thought my life was. My name is Wendell. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent the last 24 years building a commercial printing and packaging operation from a single press in a rented warehouse outside Columbus, Ohio. Today we run 3 facilities across 2 states, Ohio and Indiana, employing just over 200 people. I didn't come from money. My father, Herschel, worked the floor of a steel fabrication plant for 31 years and retired with a bad knee and a good pension. I watched him do it and decided early that I was going to build something he could point to with pride. I married Linette 23 years ago. She was a project coordinator at an architecture firm downtown, sharp and funny and better looking than I deserved at the time. We had 3 kids. Mac, who just turned 21 and had been working part-time in our operations office since he was 19, learning the business the way I always hoped a son of mine would. Sasha, 17, a junior in high school who wanted to be a marine biologist. And Pip, our youngest at 11, who was convinced she was going to run for Senate someday, and had the stubbornness to probably do it. I was proud of all of them. I was proud of the whole picture. Actually, the house we'd built in Worthington, the family dinners on Sundays, the vacation photos on the mantle. I'd spent 24 years constructing something solid. I didn't understand yet how much of it had been built on sand. The man at the center of this, besides me, was my business partner, Grover Fenn. We'd been partners for 18 years. He came on board when I was still running 2 presses and couldn't keep up with the administrative side of things. Grover handled client relations, contracts, vendor negotiations. I handled production, hiring, quality. We divided the company like a brain splits into hemispheres, and somehow it worked. I considered him one of the 5 people in the world I trusted without hesitation. He'd been at Mac's birthday parties since Mac was 3 years old. He'd taught Sasha to drive a go-kart when she was 9. He came to Pip's school play last spring and sat next to my father in the 3rd row. I know. My dad tried to warn me. Not in a dramatic way. Herschel wasn't a dramatic man. But last October, when we were watching a Buckeyes game at his place in Clintonville, he turned the volume down during halftime and said something I've replayed 1,000 times since. "You and Linette, doing all right?" I said we were fine. He turned back to the screen and didn't say anything else for a while. Then quiet, almost to himself. "Grover's been different lately. Skittish. You noticed that?" I said I hadn't. Dad said. That was it. That was the whole conversation. But my father had been reading people for 71 years, and he didn't say things without reason. I chose to chalk it up to age, to a retired man's tendency to look for problems in places that were perfectly quiet. I understand now that he wasn't imagining things. He was watching a man whose conscience was eating him alive. The wellness retreats had been going on for about 2 years by then. Linette started them after she left the architecture firm to manage our household full-time. When Pip was born, she said she needed something for herself, which I completely understood. I was traveling for business constantly, and being home alone with 3 kids is its own kind of grind. The retreats were 3 or 4-day events, usually at spots up in Michigan or over in Kentucky. Yoga, meditation, group workshops on stress and mindfulness. She came home from each one refreshed and talkative about breath work and setting intentions, and I nodded along and was genuinely glad she had an outlet. But the retreat she went on in September was different from the moment she packed her bag. I walked into our bedroom while she was packing and saw things in that suitcase that had no business being there. For a yoga weekend, a dark green dress I'd never seen, shoes with actual heels, perfume in a bottle small enough to travel with, expensive enough that I recognized the label. Going somewhere nice after? I asked, keeping it light. She laughed it off without missing a beat. We have a group dinner on Saturday night, nice restaurant. It's part of the package this year. She said it so smoothly I almost let it go. Almost. She left Friday morning and came back Sunday night looking like what I described. Lit. From somewhere inside, taller somehow. That night she was more present with me than she'd been in months. More affectionate. More there. I lay awake afterward and stared at the ceiling and told myself to stop. I told myself that for 3 weeks. Then I stopped telling myself that and called a private investigator named Kurt Ballard that a colleague had used for a business dispute a few years back. You sure? Kurt asked me over the phone. No, I said. That's the problem. He started the following Monday. By Thursday, he called me at my office and asked me to meet him somewhere. We wouldn't run into anyone I knew. I drove to a diner off Route 40 and sat across from him in a corner booth, and he set his phone on the table between us, with a photo on the screen. It was Grover and Linette walking into a hotel entrance. Grover had his hand on the small of her back. I didn't say anything for a long time. When is this from? I finally asked. September 13th, Kurt said. The Saturday of your wife's retreat. September 13th, the night of the group dinner. How long? I said. Kurt hesitated. I can only document what I've observed directly, but based on how comfortable they are together, how they move around each other, this isn't new. I drove home that night on autopilot. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. Grover had been at our 4th of July cookout 11 weeks ago. He'd stood at my grill and flipped burgers and handed Pip a bottle of ketchup and asked me how the Indiana expansion was going. I hired Kurt to keep digging. I needed to know how deep it went. What I did in the meantime was order a home DNA test. I told myself I was being paranoid, which I said while collecting Mac's cheek swab from one he'd used and left on the bathroom counter, and while sending the samples in under a cover name, and while checking the mailbox every morning for 2.5 weeks. The results came to my office. I sat alone with the door locked and read the paternity report 3 times. Mac was not my biological son. The room didn't tilt. Nothing dramatic happened. I just sat there with the paper in my hands and listened to the ventilation system hum, and thought about the 21 years I had spent watching that kid grow, teaching him to ride a bike in a church parking lot on Sunday mornings, coaching his little league team when he was 8, badly but enthusiastically, driving him to campus for his college tour, and standing on the quad thinking my chest might actually burst. And then I thought about Grover Fenn at every single one of those birthday parties. Grover at the Little League games, cheering from the bleachers. Grover who had been positioning himself, I could see it now, I could see all of it, to have his own biological son eventually inherit my company alongside him. A quiet, long-game theft I hadn't even been aware enough to protect against. Sasha and Pip were mine. The test confirmed both of them. Just Mac. Just my oldest. Just the one I had been grooming to carry everything forward. I sat in that office for a long time before I moved. I didn't confront Linette right away. I called my attorney, Jennifer Haas, and told her what I had. She told me to bring her everything Kurt had documented before I said a word to either Linette or Grover. I spent the next 2 weeks acting like I knew nothing, which is the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. Harder than anything in business. Harder than anything, period. When I finally sat Linette down, it was on a Tuesday evening after the kids had gone upstairs. I set the DNA report on the coffee table between us and watched her face. She didn't crumble the way I'd imagined. She went very still instead, like a person bracing for impact they've been expecting for a long time. How long? I asked. She was quiet for almost a full minute. Then, Wendell. How long, Linette? Since before Mac was born, she said, very quietly. It started before we had him. 22 years. The entire length of our marriage, and longer. I told her I knew about the hotel in September. I told her I knew about Grover. I watched the stillness break apart into something desperate and wet. She started explaining. The distance between us when I was building the business, Grover being present in ways I wasn't. And I let her talk because I had already heard everything she was going to say in my head before she said it. When she was done, I told her 3 things. 1. My attorney would be in touch with hers. 2. She would not be getting this house, because our children lived here and they were staying here with me. 3. She would tell Mac the truth, or I would. She told Mac herself. I was in the room. That conversation I am not going to describe in detail here, except to say that it broke something in me. Watching my 21-year-old son's face rearrange itself in real time, as his mother explained that the man who'd been his father's business partner for 18 years was his biological father. There was a long silence. Then Max said very quietly, "Does he know?" I said yes, and that I would be dealing with Grover separately. I want to describe that meeting carefully, because people imagine these confrontations as explosive. Mine wasn't. I called Grover and asked him to come to my office on a Wednesday morning. Told him it was about the Indiana contract renewal. He walked in wearing the jacket I'd seen him wear 100 times, set his coffee on the edge of my desk the way he always did, and I let him get halfway through his first sentence before I put the hotel photo down in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. "Wendell," he said. "Don't," I said. "Just don't." The next thing I put on the desk was the DNA report. Grover's face, when he looked at that document, isn't something I can describe accurately. There was something happening on it that wasn't quite any single emotion. Something that looked like a man being forced to finally hold something he'd set down 22 years ago and had been very careful never to pick back up. "I didn't know," he said. "That he was yours, or that I knew." He didn't answer. "You've been in my company for 18 years, I said. "You've eaten at my table. You shook my hand at my son's birthday parties while knowing what you knew. What I want to understand, and I mean this genuinely, what exactly did you tell yourself every single day to make that feel okay?" He didn't have an answer for that. People like Grover never do. They become very skilled at the architecture of avoidance. I told him that Jennifer Haas would be filing for his removal from the partnership agreement and that my company's forensic accountant would be conducting a full audit going back 10 years. I told him I was also pursuing a legal claim for retroactive financial contribution toward Mac's upbringing, of expenses he had never contributed a cent toward. "You want me to pay child support," he said. "I want you to pay what you owe," I said. "There's a difference." He started to say something about Mac, about wanting some kind of relationship with him now that the truth was out. I held up one hand. "Mac is 21 years old," I said. "That decision belongs entirely to him. You don't get to appeal to me for access to my son." My son. I said it deliberately, and I meant it, and I watched him hear it. He left, and I stood at the window and watched the parking lot below, and felt something I hadn't expected right then, which was very, very tired. Telling my father was the conversation I'd been dreading most. Not because Herschel was volatile. He wasn't. But because he had trusted Grover Fenn the way men of his generation trust people who show up consistently over decades. He'd fished with him. He'd watched football with him. He'd sat 3 rows back at Pip's school play with him. I drove to Clintonville on a Saturday morning and found him in his driveway, resetting a fence post that had started to lean. He looked up when I pulled in and said, I looked like I hadn't slept in a week. I told him everything, showed him the photo. He held it for a long time. He set it down carefully on top of his toolbox and picked up his coffee, which had gone cold. He didn't say anything for 5 minutes, and I didn't push him. Finally, I knew something was wrong with that man. This past year. You tried to tell me, I said. I should have pushed harder. He shook his head. 18 years. I thought I knew him. So did I. Dad looked at his fence post, then back at me. Mac doing all right? He's having a hard time, I said honestly. He'll get through it. He's tougher than he knows. He gets that from you, Dad said. Then he went back to his fence post, which was the most Herschel thing he could possibly have done. and I sat in a lawn chair next to his driveway for another hour and let the morning be quiet around both of us. What followed was 6 months of legal proceedings. I'm going to compress here because the details were exhausting, and the outcome was what mattered. Jennifer Haas is meticulous, and she does not lose. She documented the paternity fraud, the affair, and Grover's role as the biological father of a child he'd allowed me to raise and financially support without ever contributing a dollar. The language in her filings was precise and unsparing. Linette's attorney argued for shared assets and equity in the house. Jennifer's response was polite and brief. My client's wife had engaged in paternity fraud for 22 years, had concealed the biological paternity of the couple's eldest child from both my client and the child's biological father, and had done so while the family's assets were built entirely through my client's labor and enterprise. The house stayed with me. Every business asset stayed with me. Linette's attorney stopped pushing after the second mediation session. Grover's removal from the partnership was finalized in month 3. The retroactive child support claim was settled out of court. His attorney recommended he not let it reach a judge, and I understood why. The settlement covered a substantial portion of what I'd invested in Mac's upbringing over his health care, his education costs, his car, every expense a father absorbs without thinking twice, because that's what fathers do. It wasn't everything. But it was documented, it was paid, and Grover Fenn would carry that record for the rest of his professional life. He paid in other ways that didn't appear on any settlement document. Our industry is regional, and people talk. By the time everything settled, 2 of his major client relationships had quietly redirected their business. The thing about building a reputation on someone else's foundation is that when that foundation is pulled, you find out very quickly how little was actually yours. Mac spent about 3 months being angry at everyone, which I thought was entirely appropriate. He went through a period of not wanting to be around me. I think my presence made the situation too concrete, and I gave him space without giving up ground. I texted him every few days, nothing heavy, just keeping the line open. About 4 months out, he called on a Sunday afternoon. "Can I come over?" he asked. "You don't have to ask," I said. He came over and sat at the kitchen counter, and I made coffee, and he was quiet for a while. Then, "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel about Grover." "You're not supposed to feel any particular thing," I said. "He's your biological father. That's a fact. What you do with it is yours to decide. Do you hate him?" I thought about it honestly. "I'm past that now," I said. "He made choices that cost him everything he'd built alongside us. That's its own kind of consequence." Mac nodded slowly. "I don't want to see him, not yet. Maybe not ever. I don't know." "You don't have to know right now," I said. He stayed for dinner. After dinner, he stayed and watched part of a game with me. When he left, he hugged me the way he hadn't since he was maybe 14, and I stood in the doorway after his taillights had gone, and I was okay for the first time in a long while. Sasha and Pip process things the way they process everything. Differently from each other, and differently from Mac. Sasha got quiet for about a month, and then one Saturday morning came downstairs and asked if we could take a drive. We drove out toward Dublin, and she talked for most of it about what it meant that the family she thought she had wasn't what it appeared to be. About whether trust was something that could rebuild, or whether it just left a permanent scar. I didn't give her easy answers because I don't have any. I told her that her mother loved her, that I was certain of that, and that people could love their children genuinely while still being dishonest and selfish in ways that had nothing to do with those children. I told her trust could rebuild, but it moved slowly and couldn't be rushed. She looked out the window for a while and then said, "You seem okay, Dad, like actually okay." "Getting there," I said. "Good," she said. That was enough for both of us. Pip, who was 11 and sharper than most adults I know, said almost nothing for several weeks, and then one evening looked up from her homework and said completely unprompted, "Grover's not coming to my birthday, right?" "Right," I said. "Good," she said, and went back to her homework. That was the end of that conversation. 2 years have passed since Linette walked through the front door, glowing from that September retreat. My company is in the best shape it has been in since I started it. The Indiana facilities are profitable. We brought on a new operations director who is genuinely excellent, and Mac came back to work 6 months ago with a focus and seriousness that honestly impressed me. He's not carrying the Fenn name into this company. He's carrying ours. I still own the house in Worthington. Sasha is applying to colleges with a focus on marine biology programs along the coast. Pip is, accurately, running her 7th grade class with something resembling quiet political efficiency. My father had a mild health scare last spring. I sat with him in the hospital for 2 nights, and we talked more during those 2 nights than we had in years. About his marriage to my mother, about what it means to build something real, about what loyalty actually requires, versus what we tell ourselves it requires. You did right by those kids, he told me at one point, somewhere around 2 in the morning. I tried, I said. Trying is most of it, he said. Linette lives in an apartment in Dublin now. She has a job again, project coordination work. The kids see her, Sasha and Pip, more regularly, Mac on his own terms, which are still limited. She and I communicate through attorneys and occasionally about logistics. I don't hold what happened in contempt the way I did in the early months. Contempt requires energy I'd rather put somewhere that actually returns something. What I understand now that I didn't before any of this is that I had been so focused on building something external, the company, the facilities, the revenue numbers, that I had stopped paying attention to whether the structure inside my own house was holding. I'm not saying what Linette did was my fault. It wasn't. What she did was her choice, made repeatedly over decades, and the consequences belonged to her. But I missed signals for years, because I was looking in the wrong direction. And I can own that part. I don't miss them anymore. I pay attention now. It costs almost nothing, and returns more than I know how to measure. My dad tells me I raise good kids. I tell him they were already good. I just didn't get in their way. That's the most honest thing I know how to say.